It can be difficult to get into language learning. There are dozens of products out there and quite a few competing opinions about how languages should and shouldn't be learned. But where should you get started? At Migaku, we think that language learning is actually pretty straightforward. If you consume content and you understand messages in that content, you will make progress. Phrased differently, what all successful learners have in common is that they've gotten a massive amount of exposure to their target language, which is what we call the language someone is learning. 80 years ago, it was difficult to regularly interact with your target language in most cases. If you were learning Korean and you lived in Kansas, the only way to be surrounded by Korean was to move to Korea. Very few people were willing or able to do this, so their only opportunity to engage with Korean was to take classes. Today, this is no longer the case. There's a lifetime worth of content online, so you can skip the classroom and engage directly with your target language, its culture, and its media, no matter where you happen to live. You no longer need to go to Korea to read Korean books, watch Korean movies, or to listen to Korean podcasts or K-pop music. With this in mind, our methodology is built around three main stages. The learning stage, which is when you build the foundation you need to start learning by consuming target language content. The input stage, which is when you build on that foundation by consuming and learning from content in your target language. And then finally, the output stage, in which you begin writing and speaking and consolidate all the knowledge you've gained into knowledge that you can consciously use. Let's look at these stages in a bit more detail now. The learning stage. We make progress in a language by consuming content and understanding messages in that content. The messages you understand in a piece of content might initially only be a single word or sentence, but over time, the messages you understand will become more complex. For example, strings of words instead of a single word, or many sentences in a row rather than a single one. Eventually, you'll understand full dialogues without issue. The linguistic term for consuming content and understanding its messages is comprehensible input. As you consume and understand more messages in your target language, you begin to understand how that language works. You are exposed to new words, see how those words are used, observe how people express ideas, and more. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine and will naturally decode a language and overcome most language learning hurdles automatically just by being given enough time and comprehensible input. But when you're just starting out, there will be few to no comprehensible messages in target language content. So we need to bridge the gap from understanding nothing to beginning to be able to understand messages. So let me explain how we do that. We do this by first building a strong foundation in your target language. This foundation consists of three key parts: an understanding of your target language's writing system so you can begin reading the language, an understanding of your language's sound system so you can begin making sense of what you are listening to, and in doing so, begin making observations about how the pronunciation of your target language differs from your native language. Recognizing these areas of differences will help you to avoid common mistakes and develop a more natural accent. Lastly, we need a knowledge of the most common vocabulary words and grammar points in our target language. A college-educated speaker knows about 30,000 words, but those words aren't used equally often. Learning the 2,000 most common words lets you recognize 80% of all the words you'll encounter. So focusing on these common words lets you make rapid progress. Alongside that, learning the most frequently used grammar patterns lets you make sense of how those words come together to form messages in your target language. Migaku has put together courses that streamline the process of building this foundation for you. Our Migaku Fundamentals course will introduce you to your target language, its writing system, and its pronunciation, which is everything you need to know to begin making sense of real words and sentences. Then our Migaku Academy courses teach you the basic grammar points and most commonly used words. There are lessons for each grammar point and grammatical concept, and flashcards that expose you to real sentences that use those grammar points. By studying these flashcards, you learn to intuitively understand how those points and concepts are used. These sentences have been carefully curated so that each of them introduces only one new vocabulary word or grammar point, resulting in a very smooth learning curve. By the time you finish your Target Languages Migaku Academy course, you'll be ready to begin learning by consuming content you enjoy. You'll have learned over 1,500 of the most common words in your target language, and this will enable you to roughly understand 8 out of 10 words in most content you will encounter in the input stage. Content that seemed completely foreign a few months ago will now feel quite familiar. As an aside, very independent learners who wish to get to the input stage as quickly as possible may prefer our Quick Start courses, which focus only on the most common 1,000 vocabulary words and contain less detailed grammar explanations than our Academy courses do. We'll cover these courses in much more detail in future videos, so check those videos out later to find out more. But for now, we'll move on and talk about the input stage of learning. As we've said, you make progress in a foreign language by consuming content and understanding messages in that content. One of the biggest issues with the classroom approach to language learning is that it often forces you to learn things that someone else thinks would be good to learn, even if those things aren't actually relevant to your goals or interests. This often means that you will spend a lot of time practicing uncommon words instead of the common ones you need to make native content accessible. This can not only be boring, but also a huge waste of your time. To correct for this issue, Migaku's courses teach you the most frequently occurring vocabulary words and grammar points. In other words, the words that are the most useful for beginning to understand target language content. After finishing our courses, you then get to choose the content you personally find interesting to learn from. It will take at least hundreds of hours to learn a language to an advanced level of fluency, so it's important that you enjoy the process and are excited about your learning. At this stage of your learning, Migaku becomes a toolbox. Instead of telling you what to learn, we provide robust tools that help you find interesting content that is appropriate for your level. Then we help you to understand messages in that content and to identify sentences that provide good learning opportunities for new vocabulary. You can then turn those sentences into flashcards, which you then later study and review, which ensure that you will retain what you've learned. It's a complete system that guarantees rapid progress. As you spend more time interacting with content you enjoy and capitalizing on the learning opportunities it presents, you'll build the specific skills you need to better and eventually quite effortlessly understand it. The input stage of language learning doesn't ever really end, but before long, you'll reach a point where it no longer feels like work. You're simply consuming content you enjoy, and as a byproduct of interacting with your target language, you get better and better at it. Spending time in your target language will be a lot of fun. And because you'll mostly be interacting with content you find interesting, just like you do with your native language, the whole process with time will become increasingly effortless. Even though we understand that might be tough to believe when you're just starting out. While consuming content in your target language, you'll be exposed to and over time, master thousands of words and hundreds of grammar points and sentence structures. They'll feel foreign at first, but as you keep encountering them in new contexts, they'll become increasingly easy to understand. Eventually, you'll understand them as effortlessly and automatically as you do your native language. Somewhere along the line, you'll also notice that you don't just understand these words when you encounter them. You recall them easily and have conscious access to them as needed. The words have become part of your active vocabulary, and your target language's grammar and sentence structures now feel intuitive to you. This means that you're ready to begin speaking and writing. Producing sentences in your target language, which is an example of active knowledge, is different from receiving and understanding them, which is an example of passive knowledge. It's important to remember that these two skills don't perfectly overlap. Even in our native language, we can understand many more things than we can produce. For example, I can read the author Hemingway, but I can't write like him. That is to say that learning to speak or write well requires a lot of practice speaking and writing, just as learning to read and listen well takes a lot of practice reading and listening. What you'll find though is that your brain has been processing all of the input you've given it so far, and you'll have built a very strong foundation about how ideas are expressed in your target language. And this will enable you to rapidly transform your passive knowledge into active knowledge. Although speaking and writing your first few sentences will be difficult, you'll very quickly make rapid progress in becoming able to fluently express yourself in your new language. We'll talk more about recommendations for the output stage later in the series. In summary, with Migaku, you first learn the foundational knowledge of a language through our courses, and then you progressively broaden your understanding of that language by consuming content you enjoy and understanding messages in that content. In the next video, we'll talk about the tools we've created to help you learn directly from interesting target language content. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, see you in the next video.